All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, or you might be watching this recorded, as we kick off a short series of virtual programs taking place over the next few weeks here in May of 2022. These virtual programs, are going to provide a closer look at our newest exhibit coming up soon, titled A History of Healing, Infectious Diseases and Community Responses to Defeat Them. This exhibit, opening on May 21st, will focus on the local and worldwide impact of such diseases as the 1918 flu, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, typhoid, cholera, HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19. In addition to examining the impact diseases had on our health and well-being, the exhibit will also highlight particular instances in the past as well as the present where local citizens came together during previous pandemics and epidemics for the betterment of their communities. So be sure to come and check out this exhibit when it opens on May 21st of this year, 2022. Before I bring on Barb for today's program to give you a little sneak peek of some content from this exhibit, where we will be today talking tuberculosis, did just want to go over a few things before we get started. So first, let us know where you're watching from by writing down in the comment section below where you're tuning in from this morning or where you're watching the recording. We're streaming live from Champaign County here at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, so would love to know where you folks are tuning in from today as well. Also, if you have any questions during the course of this program, feel free to drop those in the comments section. We would love to answer any questions that you may have. Lastly, the next two programs in the series are going to occur in the coming weeks. Next week on Wednesday, May 11th, I'll provide a closer look at some of the community responses to infectious diseases that are going to be featured in the new exhibit. And then the following week, May 18th, our curator, Mark Hansen, will provide a closer look at house calls, discuss the whys and wherefores of house calls by doctors and other medical professionals, why they declined, and why there's been a recent resurgence of them here in the present day. So tune in to see artifacts, images, and stories just like during today's program in those next two virtual closer look programs coming up in the next couple weeks. You can learn more about Museum of the Grand Prairie and CCFPD by finding us on social media, or visiting museumofthegrandprairie.org or ccfpd.org. So again, let us know where you're watching from. Perry is tuning in from Urbana. Thanks for tuning in, Perry. Good to see you. Sarah tuning in from Champaign. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. So let's bring on Barb for the program today. Let me bring on Barb here. Hey, Barb, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. So Barb is going to be presenting our program today. Barb is the director of the Museum and Education Department at the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, which includes overseeing the staff and operations here at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, as well as the Homer Lake Interpretive Center at Homer Lake Forest Preserve, and then also all educational programming and interpretation throughout the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And Barb is going to be talking tuberculosis today, the title of today's program. So without further ado, let's give Barb a warm virtual welcome, and I'll turn the show over to you, Barb.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Hey, Pat, can you put the slides up?
Yes.
We're going to talk about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is not nearly the problem it was at the beginning of the 20th century today, although there are some strains of tuberculosis that are antibiotic resistant today. The way that we got beyond tuberculosis was really by an all-out push to improve public health. There were broad campaigns to provide health services to people. There were broad campaigns to keep people from doing things that were unsafe. And there were also broad campaigns to detect tuberculosis through x-rays. But that didn't happen until they actually figured out at the end of the 19th century what tuberculosis was, which is a bacterium that responds pretty well to streptomycin. They've discovered that in the 1930s. There's the beautiful bacterium. It's a tiny, tiny little thing. This is blown up thousands of times, but it makes little tubes, hence the name tuberculosis. It was discovered in 1895 by a German physician named Robert Koch. And I think he's the next picture. Yeah. Funny thing about Robert Koch is that he has a beard and a mustache. And when they discovered that it was a germ that caused tuberculosis, then all of a sudden and that it was something that was coughed up, then all of a sudden they determined that maybe it wasn't such a good idea to have a beard and a mustache where all those germs were caught. Yeah, Pat's feeling his face.
Maybe I got to trim it up anyway, so maybe I should cut the whole thing off.
Well, and it's interesting because, like, from Abraham Lincoln to the end up to William Howard Taft, everybody had whiskers except for one president, I think. So it was really the style in the late 19th century, and that was because they thought that bad air caused disease, miasma, and so then having whiskers would protect your face. But after they determined that it was actually a tiny, tiny little germ, a bacillus, then they decided maybe people shouldn't be wearing beards anymore. And actually, they also thought women shouldn't be wearing long skirts anymore because the germs would be caught on the hem of their skirts. But next, please. Can you turn on? Yeah, there you go. We got all kinds of interesting cultural changes from tuberculosis, which I think is fun. One of them is the Adirondack Chair. There was a physician in New York who contracted tuberculosis, and he was told to go someplace that made him happy to die. And so as a child, he had grown up vacationing in the Adirondack Mountains in Vermont. And his name was Trudeau. And that's him on the left there. He went to Vermont and all of a sudden started feeling better. And so he thought that it was the cold, dry air that was making him better. And it probably did help. But his notion that cold air would make people better started an entire movement, a movement that included building sanitaria where people could be cured of tuberculosis by sitting outside a lot of the time and reclining so that their lungs could completely inflate, and that's where the Adirondack Chair came from. The advertisement in the middle is from the time period that Trudeau was running the Saranac Sanitarium, and then the Adirondack Chair that we know came from that. Next. So in the early 20th century, there was, as I said, a huge push for to change public health standards, and the Red Cross became involved, and a nationwide movement to anti-tuberculosis movement was started with chapters all over the country, and eventually that organization becomes the American Lung Association, who sells Christmas seals, and you might actually recognize that symbol with the double cross at the bottom of the page from that. But they put out a whole bunch of advertising to keep people from spitting, from coughing, and from sneezing on other people, which is really the first time in history that was done. And sorry about this. They also this is really interesting. They also told people not to ingest what they coughed up because it could further infect your body. And so all kinds of containers were sold to catch your spit, and you were supposed to spit on the sidewalk. You were supposed to spit in these little containers. And that picture on the right is 3 of them, a little box. And interestingly enough, Kleenex comes from the same phenomenon. The recommendation was to spit into a piece of paper and then burn the paper, but because everyone used a cloth handkerchief at that point, but it seemed Kleenex was developed actually to remove cold cream, but they found out that everybody was using it actually to sneeze or cough into, and so they changed their marketing based on, believe it or not, a study they did in Peoria, Illinois. So,
Cool.
Next one. So what is it about tuberculosis that we don't know? Well, tuberculosis, before there was a cure, before they knew what we know now about germs, that bacteria cause tuberculosis, and that those bacteria can be defeated. The way one dies from tuberculosis is slow, and one gets thinner and thinner and becomes pale, and very dramatically coughs up blood usually. And so in the 19th century, this became a kind of a marker of beauty. And the model for this painting on the left, which is actually Ophelia from Hamlet, was kind of the poster child for this model of thin, pale, wan beauty that was the consumptive look. Consumption was another name for tuberculosis because it consumed your body until it was done, until you were completely consumed. And you can see that motive fashion in the fashion plate on the right screen of the screen. Pat, the next one, please. And this makes it into popular culture in a big way. The heroine of the opera La Boheme has consumption on the left. In the 1930s, a very famous movie by it was previously a book and a fable, featuring Greta Garbo, and that black and white still there, was called Camille, and the entire movie is Greta Garbo dying from consumption. And believe it or not, the heroine of Moulin Rouge, that movie that came out about 20 years ago, is dying of consumption. That is what she's sick with. She's got tuberculosis. So it's that myth of the slow, beautiful, tragic death still lingers with us, and it's thanks to tuberculosis. Pat, next, please. So what did we do in Champaign County about tuberculosis? Well, there were so many sanitaria, you wouldn't believe it. There were probably 8 or 9 sanitaria, meaning places where people could linger with tuberculosis because it couldn't be cured. But they didn't want them in the hospitals because hospitals are really for acute illnesses. Although at that time people stayed in hospitals a lot longer than they do now. So there was a sanitarium. There are 4 or 5 private sanitaria in the 1916 election. The county voted for a referendum to build a county sanitarium, which ran until the 1970s. And in 1922, Margaret B. Carle Morse left a significant amount of money to build a sanitarium. And that core of money was added to by a big fundraising campaign. And they built this building, which is the Margaret B. Carle Sanitarium, then became the Eastern Illinois Sanitarium, and eventually became Carle Hospital. So our attempts to defeat tuberculosis in our county have become one of the biggest healthcare facilities in our county and surrounding area. We have the people who were trying to keep people safe and provide public health for us to thank for their fight against tuberculosis. And that's what I got. Yeah. Oh, that's the county sanitarium. That was the, oh, and I forgot to say, I thought this, now there's one more. Well, go ahead with the next one. There's, this is an X-ray of a tubercular lung. And we know now, because of X-rays of mummies, we know now that tuberculosis was with us as far back as we have mummified remains. There are tubercular lungs. So we know that it's been plaguing humans since at least 3000 BC. And while we still have it with us today, we have made incredible strides to defeat it. And actually, the X-ray was a huge part of our defeating it in this county. In the 1957, I believe, there were 50,000 X-rays taken of county residents to assure that they didn't have tuberculosis, or to weed out who did have tuberculosis. And by the 1960s, it was down to about 8,000 because it was no longer needed. So in that very short, those very short years between the building of our sanitarium in the 1920s and the 1940 years later in the 1960s, we basically have hardly any cases and don't need a sanitarium anymore. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. So, and it is thanks to X-rays and antibiotics. I think that's it. Yep. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, thanks for that, Barb. It's interesting, looking at this exhibit, looking at, as mentioned, it's going to highlight different, the major influence of, disease on our lives. And, some of these big things that we know now, like you mentioned with the Adirondack Chair, who would have thunk that it, has its ties to, its origin story relates to tuberculosis, and same thing with Kleenex. And then these big organizations, nationally and locally, the American Lung Association, and then Carle Hospital, which is such a huge piece of Champaign County and Central Illinois history, altogether, and such a huge organization in today's day and age, has its origins with tuberculosis and disease, and has impacted our lives for a long time and continues to do so. So appreciate that, Barb. Susan mentioned, not really a question, but mentioned that she worked in Ukraine Roma villages who still have high rates of TB. I was going to ask Barb, you mentioned we've come a long way here in the United States. Do you have an idea of, she mentioned that Susan mentioned still has high rates of TB in Ukraine. Here in the United States, we've done a pretty good job with it, but do you know the current standing in the rest of the world? Is it still, whether it's Ukraine or other spots, have a major impact?
There are higher rates of tuberculosis in other parts of the world, certainly. It's not terribly high anywhere right now, although, knowing what we know about tuberculosis and how to defeat it, it's sad that there are any. And those areas tend to be in Asia and Africa, unfortunately, which points to, poverty, hunger, and disease are always with us, and the distribution of wealth around the world is part of the problem when it comes to any of those things.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm sure. I don't think though that the problem that we are concerned about, that medical establishment is concerned about, is disease resistant. I mean, antibiotic resistant tuberculosis, because taking antibiotics works if they're taken in a regular way, the way they're supposed to be taken. But if they're not taken in that regimen, then the disease gets a chance to develop an immunity to the antibiotic, right? So that's the issue. And that's true not just of tuberculosis, but of other diseases.
Perry had a question. Was the Karl Sanitarium located on what is now the Carle campus? I assume like the Carle Foundation Hospital campus is what it means.
Yeah, I think so. I found evidence that the Buseys actually donated the land and that it was on University Avenue in the roughly the same area. So I think, yes, it was. And that building that I showed you was actually an addition that was designed by Royer, believe it or not. It looks so very 1930s to me.
Susan adds, we worked in open windows rooms and wore masks, got tested 10 weeks after returning home, always negative. So a lot of see a lot of similarities between TB and, of course, still dealing with COVID-19.
Well, the interesting thing about open windows, well, I mean, good ventilation, of course, is going to make everything healthier. But there was a school. There was a school on Randolph Street that was the high school before Edison. The Edison building became the high school, and then Edison became a middle school, and we have the current high school. But in Champaign, there was a high school there that when it became a middle school, they took the top floor of the school and made it an open window school. And they did not put kids who were already sick there, but they did put kids who were failing in health in some way. Maybe they had poor nutrition, or they were just sickly, and to keep them from getting tuberculosis. And that lasted for a good 15 years. And they said they kept the temperature at 58 degrees regardless, and
wow.
Windows were always open, even in the winter, and the kids would wear, they called them Eskimo suits. I didn't make up the name, but they were, like thermal suits so that the kids wouldn't actually get cold. They would just be breathing cold air. So open windows is a big part of it. Any house that was built between 1900 and 1940 probably has some kind of porch meant for sleeping, so that you could sleep with cold air.
Is open air ventilation not a new idea?
Nope, that's right. It's COVID. COVID didn't invent it.
Right. Yeah.
COVID didn't invent a lot of this stuff,
Yeah. Well, that seems to be the end of the comments or questions at this juncture. We're getting close to 10:30, so appreciate the presentation, Barb, on tuberculosis. And if you want to learn more about TB, tuberculosis or the local impact of disease, the influence it had on the Champaign County and surrounding Central Illinois area. Again, be sure to check out the exhibit when it opens on May 21st, Saturday, May 21st. And then Susan also asking here, will there be more talks? And yes, there will be. We'll do 2 more of these closer look programs. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's program, next week on Wednesday, May 11th, I'm going to present a program about community responses. So more, Barb talked about community responses today, Carle Hospital and even the open windows schools, how the community responded locally to disease. We'll have those talks coming up. And then our curator, Mark Hansen, the following week on Wednesday, May 18th, we'll talk about house calls, history of them, why they declined, and then their recent resurgence here in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also, after the exhibit opens, going to continue this content. We're going to put on a special exhibit speaker series, virtual speaker series, having at least one presentation on a topic related to the exhibit, a history of healing, history of public health, and a history of infectious diseases, and a bunch of different topics throughout the year. So stay tuned. We'll have some more programming that'll take place, some more virtual programming that'll take place associated with the exhibit. Stay tuned, to our website or our social media pages to find out more about those as info becomes available. So, Barb, any final thoughts? Any last words here?
No, I think that it's kind of an off-putting topic. Who wants to go see an exhibit about disease? But I would encourage you to come see it, because to me, it's astounding how many things that we take for granted that are life improvements came from people before us who very valiantly fought disease, right? The hospital is just one of them. Because of that, we have a lot of positive things, because people have been trying to keep us healthy for a long time. So that's what I want people to come away from the exhibit seeing, and from our talks too.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of instances of people coming together. Just as we found out during the COVID-19 pandemic, people came together in great ways. That's also not new. So learn more about how the community came together with our exhibit coming up. So thank you, Barb. Appreciate the talk today. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. If you have any further questions, feel free to put those in the comment section, and hope to see you at the Museum of the Grand Prairie to check out the exhibit and or checking out some of these virtual programs coming up. So everybody, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.